Welcome to the Front End Nerdery podcast, a podcast about front end development and design. I'm your host, Todd Libby. My guest today is accessibility engineer, speaker, and black belt in Taekwondo. So don't mess with Rachel. It's Rachele DiTullio. Did I get that right? I hope I did.
Yep, that's perfect.
Okay. All right. Rachel, how are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty well. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. Never mind the other stuff we talked about before I recorded. How about would you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Like you said, my name's Rachele DiTullio. My first name is spelled Rachele, in case anyone's looking that up. I started out as a front-end engineer, web developer back in 2000. There wasn't really much to study academically about web development at that point, so it was a passion of mine throughout college. Kind of taught myself basic web development, and that's what I went into as a profession. After a few years, I decided to go to graduate school while I was working full-time to pursue a master's degree in information science with a specialization in user experience design. And that's where I really started to hone my interest in accessibility and usability. And after finishing grad school, I was able to start applying some of those concepts in my job and doing more and more sort of self-learning on the internet about accessibility and those concepts. A couple of years ago, I decided to pursue the web accessibility certification through IAAP. So I got that one first, and then I got the CPACC certification. And with both of those, I decided to apply for accessibility engineering jobs, and I've been doing that for almost a year now exclusively, moving from being a software developer to accessibility engineer.
Nice. I am actually looking into, I think the first one I'm going to do is the trusted tester.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
And then go for the CPACC and the WAS. Not sure. I'm so indecisive. It changes day to day. So first question I like to ask everybody is, how did you get started in your web development design journey?
Yeah, it was in the late 90s, and a friend of mine showed me the internet outside of a dial-up service, and when I found out what the real internet was and the real web was, I was immediately entranced and wanted to learn how to do my own pages, have my own, there weren't blogs per se at the time, but my own space on the internet to put up whatever I wanted. So just the openness, the fact that anybody really could put something online really drew my attention. I thought that was great, a great way to just share with the world without any, filters or censors, essentially. You could just put what you wanted out there. I thought that was great.
Yeah, that's pretty similar to how I started. I don't remember which one it was first, but GeoCities, Angel Fire, Tripod.
Yeah, mine was GeoCities.
Yeah, I think mine was GeoCities, but I just, when I found out, when I could get online and then found out, oh wow, I can make my own stuff, put it online. I just, I had to get a site on every one of those platforms. So, so yeah. Let's talk accessibility, because it's what we do, first of all. And second of all, there's a lot going on I see on Twitter lately. So
yeah.
What are you finding? And I've asked this of a few people that I've had on before, but what are you finding that you come across day to day that is the, I guess, issue that stands out that you see the most when you're doing an audit or your day-to-day routine?
Yeah, so I've been doing a combination of regular website audits, but also gotten into some mobile testing, whether that's a native app or using some kind of web view in a mobile app. And what I've come across a lot are, usually controls that don't have an accessible name, or the accessible name doesn't match the label, which is oftentimes kind of a blocker, because if a user doesn't understand what a control does, they don't know when to use it or how to use it. So yeah, probably a combination of the lack of accessible name, and also particularly in mobile for some reason, controls not having the correct role, so not identifying themselves as buttons, or a disclosure widget or something, some kind of control. Even they want the concept of radio buttons, but it's not quite marked up as radio buttons. It's marked up as 3 separate buttons, like actual buttons instead of radio buttons. So you don't get the sense of like how many are there and which one is selected and that kind of thing. So a lot of that 412 stuff, I think a lot of us come across. And for me, that's particularly interesting. I find it interesting, the pieces of the interface that are beyond the UI, that are programmatically defining, what controls are, what things are named. Because I think, it's, if you just stop with the UI and you're only concerned with how it looks, you're really missing out on a large part of the functionality of an interface. And, whether that's having a UI that's just entering text like a console line kind of interaction, or, having to use something like a screen reader, you really benefit if you have those controls marked up correctly.
I did I guess I did an audit a while ago. I think, well, last year, seems like a while ago. Controls were one of the big problems with that. The labeling. I even had fun with orientation in reflow and all that good stuff that comes along with it. So yeah, I understand and hear you on that one. So I've talked about this before, but what's your thoughts on how, and I don't like to, try and guess, but what's your thoughts on how important accessibility is to user experience?
That's a really good question. I think a lot about that kind of relationship between usability and accessibility. Where does one end? Where does one start? Because that's kind of a blurry line, but there are definitely things where, we come across them and we think, oh, this might be a bad user experience, but it doesn't necessarily technically violate WCAG, right? So we have a lot of those situations, but I think if you are following WCAG, to some extent, I mean, that's tremendously important in guiding you to an accessible endpoint. If you are not looking at those requirements and how to apply them in the design and development part of the process, you're going to end up in QA with something that's inaccessible and difficult to fix. So yeah, I think it's tremendously important. And I think, for as much lip services UX gets in meetings, I think accessibility, could get some more talking points. When I came from a large software company, working on, one product for many years, and it was just very difficult to get, people on board with accessibility. I tried all the things, empathy and, it's the right thing to do, and legal matters. But, when it comes to when it really comes down to it, you need a champion internally. I think if you're someone who's working at a corporation that is big and has maybe multiple projects, not just software that the company is developing, but perhaps things that you're deploying and doing DevOps on, that if you don't have that accessibility mind space, then you're going to run into problems trying to get up to speed or getting that you know, accessible and workable, whether that's because you got sued or you end up having that executive level champion that wants to do the right thing and make things accessible. It's hugely important. So I would really encourage you to, you know, if you're in a situation like that in a company where you're having some, you know, pushback on making things accessible, look for that champion, talk to someone higher up, you know, talk to people in other departments and get kind of the word going. I was not having a lot of success in my own department in IT, really changing thoughts and minds, but I was able to affect folks in marketing more. They were the ones producing the content and ultimately responsible for the website. So it was easier to get them on board to, and you know, once I started having sort of lunch and learns and talking to them about some of the easier concepts, they were on board. They were excited. You know, I found that once people really understand accessibility and what it's going to do, they tend to appreciate it. You know, they get past the dollar signs and they understand that this is the correct way to be doing it. So that's what we should be doing. I hope that answered your question. It's kind of long-winded.
Yeah, it did. I kind of touched on that when I wrote that article for Smashing Magazine. You know, once you get somebody, whether it's one person in a department on board that can, you know, for lack of a better term, be infectious and spread throughout the organization.
Yeah.
Important to get stakeholders in on it too, because, you know, once you have stakeholders bought in, then that trickles down. And, you know, when, you know, in my experience, you see a stakeholder saying, you know, accessibility is a priority, then people are going to be on board.
Yeah.
So I want to touch on this one point that I have right in front of me here, that, and I've been dealing with this quite a bit lately in the real world, in the wild, and that's semantic HTML, because so first I'd like to ask, you know, I have only seen maybe at the most two, whether it be I think one might have been a boot camp, the other one was a higher education school that taught accessibility.
Right.
And I know, and you know, I think we both know learning HTML, semantic HTML, progressive enhancement, that's very important. How important, for the people that may not know, how important is that? And then I have a follow-up.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I've also been thinking about that in the context of, you know, modern day frameworks. I don't work with much of that anymore, but, you know, I see the results of it every day when I'm doing auditing. And I think we've kind of lost something on the web where we have software that's creating these components for us, but a lot of folks don't really understand what it's creating and what the output is. And when that happens, that link to accessibility is kind of broken. If folks, you know, are using proprietary markup to, you know, in a framework to then ultimately spit out HTML or JavaScript, if you don't understand what it's spitting out, you don't necessarily know what you're possibly introducing as accessibility issues. So I think it's extremely important for folks who are using those frameworks to also put in the time to understand the building blocks, the, you know, just plain Jane HTML. What do those semantic elements actually mean? They're not just there. I think there's a belief among a lot of developers who don't work with the front end from a design perspective, but only from a development perspective, who think that HTML is still a presentational markup, is used just for look and feel in some respects. And I don't think, you know, there's enough understanding that when we say semantic HTML, we're saying that those building blocks, those elements, give purpose and meaning in a lot of contexts. Yes, you do have, you know, semanticless elements like divs all over the place that you do need to use oftentimes to affect presentation. But what you're really trying to do is build a core workable app that has, you know, proper control names, proper labeling, proper understanding of what it's functionally supposed to do versus what it looks like. I just had so many conversations about look and feel, and it's so much beyond that. It really is. So I think it's very important, if you are creating things out of a framework, go look at the end result and try to understand, you know, whether that's and whether that's something complex, like you're using the framework because you need a combo box with autocomplete. Well, you can go in there and see, okay, well, what does that mean? What are the ARIA requirements on that? You know, is my control doing those proper things? Even though my framework created it, is it correct? Is there anything that I can do to mitigate that? And on the other hand, with that too, something I experienced, and I know a lot of folks, you know, you'll have your department that's deploying your code, that's managing your plugins, and if there is an accessibility issue in one of those third-party tools, there's often a hesitation to do any customizations to that, because it does make it harder to then update to the latest version, whatever that is. But if you just leave the accessibility issues, that's not ideal. So I would encourage folks that if you can start to understand some of these problems, then you can feed back to your framework of choice, to your plugin of choice, and help those developers understand, like, well, you know, you need aria-expanded equals true on this disclosure widget. You know, you're missing the proper state. Just small things like that. And then, I mean, I know there's thousands and thousands of bugs out there filed for accessibility issues, but you know, that's, I think, part of our responsibility in a sense. If we understand what the issues are, we've got to say something about it. So even if you're not like super familiar with everything that's going on in HTML, you can still look at the result, you can test it, and you can feed back to vendors, you know, here that this is something that would make make something better for everyone because it's inaccessible.
Definitely. So my follow-up being, should we be seeing more higher learning / boot camps teaching accessibility?
I think so. So when I was in graduate school, I graduated in 2012, and you know, there wasn't anything. I mean, I was in a top 10 library science school that, you know, usability and accessibility, well, not accessibility so much, but usability and user experience were definitely, you know, something that people went there to study, and to just see a dearth of accessibility at all, I found concerning. I was able to take some classes on disability in the School of Social Work as sort of support work, but you know, it wasn't accessibility training or anything like that. I think a class in accessibility core concepts would be amazing. I've been in talks with the former dean of my program here at UT Austin about that, and I've offered to go speak. You know, it started out as, you know, going to speak to one of his classes and talk about accessibility and accommodating people with disabilities through, you know, whatever you know, lens of whatever they're learning at the time. And I'm happy to go do that. And that's really why I started doing the public speaking, was to just get a greater reach, a broader reach to developers, or even brand new folks who just aren't getting access to this material. There is great material out there, don't get me wrong. There's plenty of multi-week accessibility courses that you can take online that I've found very useful. And I would encourage folks to take those on their own if they're looking for something. There's definitely great material out there. But I would love to see more structured accessibility learning, whether at undergrad level, not graduate school level necessarily, but just whether that's computer science or design, communication. I'm not sure what the big degrees are now for studying web development, but I think it is very important to understand, accessibility is a lot about how lots of different people use websites, not just how we ourselves, the developers or designers, use websites. So we've got to kind of flip that lens around and start looking out, and who is likely to be using my site beyond someone like myself, and what are the things I need to learn to accommodate that.
Yeah, definitely. When I was in school, wow, 2002, it was definitely nothing as far as accessibility goes. I had known about it. There had been some, there were, the people that were with the Web Standards Project at the time, and people like Derek Featherstone, and folks in that space. And I remember we were in, I think it was like a basic web design course. And we were using Internet Explorer 5.2 on a Mac. And when I went to look at things in Firefox, because Firefox was really in its infancy, I think it was like not even, it might have been around 1.0 at the time. I went, wow, that does not look anything like I had in, of all things, Internet Explorer 5.2 on a Mac. But and that's when I said, does anybody around here, I said, does anybody around here teach accessibility? And no. And it's like, well, shouldn't they? And I still, to this day, I'm a little bit surprised still, but not a lot as I used to be with when I talk to somebody that, they graduated from a boot camp, for instance. And I'm like, did they teach accessibility? No, they didn't. I did have somebody tell me, well, they did teach us alt text on an image. That was it. So the need is there, in my opinion, and I've of course ranted and raved on Twitter about that before, but it's definitely, I think, in agreement with you that something we need, because I look at the Web 8 Million report every year and I cringe.
Yeah.
So
well, do you think there's a lack of will to teach it, or it's more that the instructors don't know, so they're unlikely to present it? Like, how do we crack that egg?
Yeah, that's a good question, because so when after I graduated, I had a design degree. I would look around for courses, was there a course at the local, community college, and there never was, but there was always web design. So I actually sat in on a couple of these, and I think the last one was, I can't even remember, it's so long ago, but they were still teaching table-based layouts.
Oh,
they was still,
wow.
they was still things that I know that I had to bite my tongue, but old methods that you would find in a computer book from, a design book from 30 years ago, 20 years ago, that's
yeah.
I think there's, I don't know. I don't know. Other than I don't think anyone has taken the initiative to say, you know what, somebody needs to do something and present accessibility in a program and actually do it. Maybe the thought has been there, but I haven't, I haven't seen it.
Yeah.
Like I said, a couple of instances where I know that it was taught. It wasn't taught in depth, but at least it was taught, I see things on, online, Udemy and Udacity, and I read through the comments, people taking these courses, and then the feedback on it. Well, great course, but it wasn't complete, or great course, but it was lacking this. And it's like, I don't know if we'll ever see the ultimate, all encompassing accessibility course. I hope so at some point. But I think it's just people, I don't think they know enough to say, yeah, let's teach this and make it part of the curriculum. I wish they would. Bring in people like yourself, bring in people in the accessibility space that do the talks and write the articles and speak about this stuff so that it is out there. So that's my long-winded that's my long-winded answer. So I guess leading from the education side now, in your day-to-day, do you do a lot of that as far as, I guess we all do when it comes to educating, whether it's on Twitter or whether it's in our day-to-day. Because I've been giving at my job, I've been giving presentations, little 10-minute presentations. Matter of fact, the last one I did was on forms and labels and
Nice.
accessible name and programmatic name. Do you do a lot of that at where you are, or do you mostly do that outside of your day-to-day?
Yeah, I work in sort of a consultant type role now, so I'm around a lot of people who know the same stuff, so we don't do as much of that knowledge sharing internally. It's something I did at my previous job for sure. I would say, when we give guidance to our clients, we certainly try to teach that, and provide accessible examples in plain HTML, so it's clear, what those core building blocks are beyond any scripting or behavior that you're going to add to it. So, I think we try to reinforce again, if we're talking semantic HTML, like, we can discuss the ARIA way of doing something, but we, say we really recommend the, just native elements with a sprinkling of ARIA as needed, like ARIA-expanded attribute. But yeah, it ends up mostly being on Twitter. I do have my own website with a blog that I try to write to now and then. But yeah, I guess if I were still if I were like on an accessibility team at a large corporation still, or a company that wasn't focused on accessibility, I would definitely be doing the lunch and learns and trying to teach folks from different dev teams what to do. I've also often thought that bigger companies that have multiple dev teams could sort of benefit from a roving accessibility person. There might not be enough for a single accessibility person on a single team, but if you have that resource that that can help multiple teams learn and grow. So you don't just, it was problematic to just be the only person who really knew the stuff if it was all siloed through me. And that's, that's not ideal. We want everybody to understand these concepts, whether it's the project manager who's going to ensure that those accessibility requirements actually get done in a project, to the developers who need to actually create the code. It's just so important for everyone to understand those concepts,
Yeah, definitely. So I just had a little discussion with this with somebody else today, but what's the, I'm trying to find the right word for this. What's the weirdest or oddest case of HTML that you've seen recently that you can think of?
Where it was just like totally wrong, or
Yes. Yeah.
well, I put this one on Twitter. Yeah, in a site I was auditing, they had used the ABBR element, abbreviation element, with a role equals button to create a custom control, and that just really threw me for a loop.
I
was
remember
like,
seeing
wow.
that. Yeah, I remember seeing that, as a matter of fact. Yeah. That one nearly knocked me back in my chair. Yeah, wow. That is, yeah. Wow. A roll a button on an abbreviation tag. That's
Yeah, I mean, you're used to seeing them on divs and spans and whatever, but like, oh, someone just went totally rogue for this.
yeah. What is something that you've learned recently that you didn't know that was accessibility related?
Oh, that's a good question. For me, I mentioned earlier, I've been doing more and more mobile audits. So seeing how WCAG applies in that space, because it's not always a web, it could have a web view. So there's some feedback that you would get, like if you were on a website but you're in an app, versus the native mobile functionality, and just kind of learning how to navigate between those has been very interesting. Kind of understanding the limitations of web views and certain ways of doing app authentication has been very eye-opening. Just understanding, there's a lot of focus management that needs to happen that doesn't always happen. So in apps, it's very common to pop up a new screen, but it's not necessarily a dialogue because it's the full screen of the app. But it, in every other way, is like a dialogue. It has a close button. It has a header that should be the accessible name. And then because it is this new screen on top of where the control was that launched the screen, if you're not moving that focus into the new screen, that's really an issue for TalkBack, or VoiceOver can't get focus in that upper screen. So just learning about focus management and mobile applications, yeah, that's been tricky, because it's kind of hard to give advice on some things if TalkBack or VoiceOver cannot get to the screen that's the highest Z index, then you can't necessarily focus on the controls to hear what the accessible names are, or something might look like a heading, but if you can't move focus there, it won't, you can't really find out, so you have to guess. So that's been interesting.
Yeah. No, I actually, now that when you mentioned that, I kind of, when I did my last mobile audit, came across, they had a flyout menu. I could get to the flyout menu with voice control. I could get to the flyout menu with VoiceOver. But, and I'm trying to remember this as best I can. you still, when you went through, I think it was voiceover, you would still get everything underneath the
Yeah,
flyout
exactly.
menu. And, you know, it was a rather large app with a lot of different, you know, the menu, the functionality underneath on the page underneath that. And it threw me for a tailspin because it was, I'm, you know, I've done mobile testing before, but not to the point where I can say, yeah, I'm, you know, very proficient at it. So it was kind of one of those instances where I was just like, that is a lot to take in during that. And with the learning, I got to mention this. I just never ran across this before, but I have a page where there's a lot of sections to the page, which is fine, and they all have ARIA labeled by on them. And I, you know, I didn't know that it made the section a landmark or something. I
Oh,
have
okay,
it.
yeah.
Yeah, I never ran into that, so that's something I learned, and this is kind of part of what I, you know, it's kind of part of what I do and why I love doing the accessibility engineering. And that's the learning part.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and it was just like, oh, well, you know, and okay, so not to, you know, sound like I'm bragging or anything, but when I got the invited expert status on the W3C, people are like, oh, he must be an expert on everything. And it's like, no, I'm not, I don't know what CAG inside and out. I just don't, you know. And then I got bombarded with, hey, I got this issue. It's
Oh,
just like,
geez.
I don't, I, I'm not a walking encyclopedia, you know, I'm not, you know, but the learning, I don't know about you, but you know, the learning is, that's part of why I love doing accessibility is the learning.
Yes,
And
absolutely. I agree with
yeah,
that. Yeah. It's always something new. There's always someone doing something
yeah,
different that needs remediation, or yeah, like you said, you just come across like, oh wow, like you can do this, but people don't usually do this. So I haven't run into this before.
yeah. And it caught me off guard. I was just like, wow. And so with what I do, and I've done this, I have a kind of a personal template of what, you know, I do in an audit. And every time I go through and I check, you know, what the problem is when I run a test on a web page or whatever, and I'm reading up the success criteria, it's like I'm figuring out more from actually taking the time to read that 2 or 3 times and saying, okay, well, this falls into that. And then I go to the understanding document. Granted, WCAG is that big old technical
Yeah.
manual that you get. You know, it's like one of the, I compare it to one of those huge, you know, 1,000-page books where somebody throws it on your desk that would run like a computer in the 1960s. You know,
Yeah.
um, but you know, digging deep and like I spent what 2 or 3 days on something. I was just like, I
Wow.
really didn't know, and I fell into a rabbit hole, and finally I was just like, now I understand it. So in your day to day, leading up to the question that I'm going to ask finally, how important is learning, and what would you tell somebody that's looking to start their journey in accessibility as far as the learning goes?
Yeah. Okay. That's a great question. I think as far as the learning goes, I think it kind of depends where you start, like I'm coming from a developer background, so I think it has been very useful, for myself to have that HTML, CSS, JS knowledge in working with remediation, but it's not necessarily required. It can help, and maybe you'll have a leg up when you start accessibility work, but it's certainly something that someone who doesn't have that development experience can get into. I work with plenty of people who have a different kind of background than me, but still ended up in the accessibility space, because there is a lot online that you can learn, whether it's through the W3C or different courses. I think there's an edX course from Google, things like that. And then, what was super helpful for me, and one of the reasons I started my blog was as a place to sort of post accessibility and usability tests, or my interpretation of some of the UX problems, and it just gave me a way, like a very structured way to mark up my findings, to have a place to warehouse them. I can reflect back on them. I can, tweet at the company like, hey, here's what I found on your site. So I think anything that you can just sort of do for yourself, even if it's at work, I try to take the philosophy of, I learn every day. It's very important. And I always look at how, whatever I'm working on, how does it benefit like my own knowledge and my own career path, and not necessarily just like what I need to do for this job or this individual project, but what can I take from that will help me progress and get better. So I think you have to have that mindset of always learning, being curious, and that will lead you, I think, to a lot of good accessibility resources. And so even if you are doing it on your own over time, like I did, you can create little exercises for yourself. Look up somebody's WCAG checklist. What I started with was, I looked up the WAI first basic, that's the basic accessibility review check, something like that. It's maybe like 8 kind of high level accessibility concepts that you can apply to a website. And I started there, and did that mean that I found all the accessibility issues? No, but that doesn't matter. Just like if most people under, like you said before, they get introduced to the concept of alt text and text alternatives on images. I mean, that's a great place to start. Just find a website, see if they have alt text there, and there are lots of neat little tools, I think, that can be helpful. There are a lot of bookmarklets out there that will, put some kind of overlay on whatever page you're looking on and tell you, oh, well, this page has a table right here, and even though it doesn't look like it, and this page, here are all the images, and here's the alt text, here are the headings outlined. There's just all kinds of little plugins and bookmarklets that you can use to augment web pages and help your learning. I don't think there's any substitute for going out there in the wild and just picking a website that you like to use and pick it apart. And I also, I personally find writing up those results in a blog or some kind of format very synthesizing. It helps me, codify my learning, and it's also a record of what I've learned to do. So if you are getting into that space, you can point and say, here are reviews that I've done, here are accessibility audits I've done. Maybe it's not like perfect 100% to how a company might want it, but you've demonstrated that you have that curiosity and that willingness to learn, to go out there and put your hand towards something. And and if you publish that, you're already contributing to the body of knowledge. Like any information out there about like this website does this and has this problems, I mean, you're helping, you're becoming part of the community. And I think that's really useful. That's why I love Twitter. I love talking with you guys, because I learn stuff every day on there too. It's not just my own learning, but it's following, other experts, other practitioners and people who, everyone's super friendly in this group. So I think if you can get into some kind of social media space where you have other folks to bounce ideas off of, it's all good. We're all learning together. I learn stuff every single day, and it's just how you got to move in this industry.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Yeah. Like you just said, the community is great, friendly. I don't think I've ever come across anybody that I've asked, so, had a accessibility question and posed it to them, and they're like, "Man, go away."
Yeah.
Everybody's so willing
Yep.
to answer questions and everything. And I tell people, like you said, Twitter, the accessibility space there, that's a great start. And what you spoke on too. So here's something that somebody asked me a while back that I'm going to ask you, and feel free to answer it how you want.
Okay.
Where's there a list that I can use for accessibility to check things off when I'm doing a project?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I just want to say I found testing methodology to be the biggest hurdle in this industry. Like it was easy for me to understand individual WCAG concepts, but understanding the full gauntlet of testing, if you're doing a WCAG 2.1 AA review, that's 50 success criteria, but how do you test the right one? How do you do it in the right order? And I have to say right now I have a cheat sheet because we have our own proprietary software with a knowledge base of items, where here are things that we come across all the time, so we have remediation advice. I think you mentioned the trusted tester certification. So there's a section 508 sort of grouping of these success criteria that I think is a good list. If you're like jumping in there, you want to do comprehensive testing, you can follow that checklist because it does cover all of, even though it's section 508, it's looking at WCAG 2.1. So now it is. So I think that I wish I had the name of it. It's ICT something, but it's the section 508 testing methodology, I think, is a good place to start to get a comprehensive understanding of everything. Because if you're just going through WCAG, line by line through the 4 guidelines, I think that doesn't give you as much context for how the different success criteria operate together or are influenced by each other. So if you have some kind of logical grouping outside of the guidelines, I think that can be useful. I can look up the link and send it to you. I'm just blanking on the name of it right now. But that's very much like the software that we're using. We can look at each discrete success criteria, but we're looking at it more holistically. Like what are all the things we need to consider for forms, for native and custom controls, and we'll test all of those things sort of in a grouping. Does that kind of answer the question?
So here's another one I got. Is accessibility just a checklist?
Ooh, that's a great question.
Yeah, that was another question I got. It was well, I got to do accessibility first, whatever. Can I just check these things off and move on?
Yeah, so accessibility is not a checklist, in my opinion. It is a methodology. It is a way of approaching your project. It's part of all points of the project, right? It's not just wherever you want to throw in a checklist. That could be QA, that could be development, but there are definitely nuanced ways of doing things. There are multiple ways of doing things. I think maybe some folks don't understand that too, that we're not saying there's like a one true way of doing it. There can be multiple ways of accomplishing the same problem, as you see in the understanding guidelines for WCAG. And again, I'll just throw out the alt text example because that's the one everybody knows. I mean, it's not sufficient to just have any old string as an alt attribute, right? So that's a perfect example of how it's not just a checklist, because, I've been on projects where, we had a list of all of our customers on the site, and it had a list of their logos and the name of the company, but all the logos, the alt attribute was image. Well, yes, that technically checks the box that yes, these images have the alt attribute, but it's not accessible because it does not distinguish one image from another. So I understand the desire to treat accessibility as a checklist, something like security. You can have a checklist like, did we do all the things? Are we going over HTTPS? Do we, and so forth. But with accessibility, it's more holistic, and there's the testing aspect and the how does the whole thing work together? Not does a single control pass a single criteria.
My answer was a little different. my answer was a little bit more abrupt. I went, no, absolutely not. No, that was a great answer. And yeah, it's a methodology. It's definitely not, it's not a feature, that's for sure.
No.
We've seen that a lot. And the more people I think anyways, that the more people look at it as a methodology rather than just, I just got to check off a few items, color contrast, alt text, this, that. Fine, we're good. Then I think a lot more people would be jumping on the accessibility hype train, I guess, for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
And I think we'd see more, I don't know, improvement, I would hope, but at least more people being, excited about accessibility, I guess. That's where I'm going with that. So as we close down, I got 3 more questions that I ask all my guests. So feel free to use, one word response, or you can go into it as much as you want. So the first question is, what about the web these days excites you and keeps you excited in what you do?
Ooh, good question. Well, I would say for one, the thing that still keeps me excited despite some of the consolidation that's going on is that you still can carve out your own space on the web. While a lot of people think, oh, Facebook is the internet, or, there's been some collapse of that ideal. It's not gone. And I see folks proclaiming this all the time, like, hey, don't just publish on X platform. If that platform goes away, your stuff goes away, publish on your own site too. And that's what keeps me excited, is that it's still relatively easy to just spin up a site and get out there. It's relatively low cost, cost of a domain, cost of hosting. It's still requires some technical knowledge, I think, that's hard for the everyday person to just spin up a site, but if you want to do it, it's definitely possible. That's what keeps me excited, because the technology is always going to change. Who knows, maybe in 10 years we'll all be in the metaverse, right? But I would hope that you can still carve out your own space and have that voice. It's so freeing. It's just like anyone around the world can see what you have to say. I mean, that doesn't mean everybody wants to see what I have to say, but I can put it out there, and it's just it's amazing self-publishing like that. I think it's great.
Yeah, it's come a long way since the days of when I used to um, have to get a host, get the domain, do all that stuff, and then FTP everything to the
Yeah.
server. It's this is one part that I really like, that I agree with, what you just said about it, that I can take all my code, push it to GitHub, that goes to Netlify, and boom, there, barring any unforeseen circumstances, those changes are made, and I'm not dragging and dropping files here and there,
Yeah.
and on every little change. So yeah, I think that's as my watch goes off, Siri's getting restless. Yeah, that's part of what excites me too. So the second question is, if there was one thing about the web you could change that we know today, what would that be?
I'll try not to get too political, but I do have a concern with the concentration of power amongst certain large corporations. And of course, there's always there's this constant threat of government censorship in one way or another. There's that case in Missouri right now where the governor is trying to sue a reporter, or criminally hold liable a reporter for viewing source on a web page and finding a security flaw. So, there's still a deep misunderstanding, I think, of a lot of things. And I think large corporations concentrating power to a few sites is part of what causes that. Again, like I mentioned before, I mean, there are plenty of places in the world where the internet is Facebook, and I think that's detrimental. I don't think we should go, that's very much how a lot of the early web was. If you got on AOL, you were pretty much in that portal. People didn't readily understand they could just open a web browser and go anywhere on the web. So I do think trying to force things through the same website, you get everything from one place, is dangerous for a multitude of reasons, but that would be my concern.
Yeah, definitely. And you weren't the first, you probably won't be the last that said the same thing. So.
Okay.
And that's totally fine on this podcast, because I feel the same way. It's my podcast. No, I'm just kidding. So the last question I have for you today is your favorite part of front-end development or design or whatever that you really like the most, that you nerd out over.
Ooh, that's a good question. I am still, I don't write a lot of CSS these days, but I still find it incredible how we have this separation of presentation from your semantic markup. I think it's really important to understand the separation of the two, and to, again, back to semantic HTML, you can build a whole website just with HTML. You don't even need to style it, right? So it's really cool to me how we have this whole other language where we can easily apply styles to this structure, this wireframe of HTML that we've created to do all kinds of things with it. CSS is amazing, and it gets a lot of flack, and it doesn't always get the respect that it deserves.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would say, learn CSS too if you're interested in like how the whole web page works. It's really cool that you can do a lot of cool things with CSS for troubleshooting. I remember back in the day, like when I was doing floats, I would give my divs different background colors, and I could see exactly where everything was coming out. And here's my border, and there was just so much you could do to visually help yourself build your site and design your site as a tool. Yeah, I think that separation of CSS and HTML and how it works so well together and apart is really neat.
Yeah, definitely. When I, a while back, saw somebody say, it's easier to do outline 1 pixel solid red instead of border to see where your divs are while you're working. I went, oh, that's it's freaking genius, you know, using the outline instead of the border.
Yeah.
It's stuff like that, you know. That's, yeah, it's exactly the same thing I nerd out over. So somebody asked on Twitter yesterday or the day before, you know, why do you love CSS? It's just that being able to sit here, program some code, and I won't go into it too much, but I think CSS and HTML are programming languages, but we won't. That's all I'll say. You know, and manipulating things and seeing things, you know, move while you're working on it. I think that is just awesome. And it's still awesome to this day. I mean, just a silly little sidebar here. When I started doing programming way back on a Commodore 64, I was doing text-based games based on those choose your own adventure books. And
Yeah.
just being able to walk through that book on a computer was so cool. That's why I got into this, you know, programming stuff. Still holds, you know, water today with me anyways, is the creating things and watching them, you know, be on a website or be alive on the web is just cool. So that's enough from me. So I know you have tentatively, which we talked about before we started recording, something going on, but I'm going to let you talk about that.
Okay.
Because right now I'd like to close the podcast with my guests, letting the listeners know what they have currently going on and where people can find you online. So the floor is yours.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, so March 14th through 18th is CSUN 2022, the Assistive Technology Conference. This would be my first year to go. Myself and two colleagues will be presenting a panel on making streaming video inclusive. We look at the same streaming app through a variety of contexts, mobile device, streaming devices, Apple TV, and so forth. So you can look for us there. Hopefully it'll be in person. We're planning on that, but if it goes virtual, we'll just record the session. So yeah, we'll be at CSUN 2022. You can find me on Twitter at Rachele DiTullio. So that's RACHELE DITULLIO. I also have my own website at racheleditullio.com, so you can find ways to contact me through either of those. That's where I am on the internet.
Awesome. So I will make sure all of that is in the show notes for this episode. And, you know, I want to thank you, Rachel, for coming on and spending part of your day with me and talking accessibility. It was a lot of fun. I had a great conversation.
Yes, thank you so much, Todd. It was fun.
All right. You're welcome. Thank you, listeners, for tuning in to the Front End Nerdery podcast. I'll be back next time with a new guest, new conversation about front-end design, development, and other topics. If you would please rate this podcast on your podcast device of choice, like, subscribe, and watch on the Front End Nerdery YouTube channel. Links to transcripts and show notes are there because I want to make this podcast accessible, tying into our little theme here today. I'm Todd Libby, and this has been the Front End Nerdery podcast. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.